Hare Krishna. Thank you everyone for joining. Today we'll be continuing the chapter 26 of Canto 3. Last week we saw up to verse 8. So now we will see from the next verse. So last week we discussed how Devahuti and Kapila Dev spoke about or had a conversation on devotional service in the previous chapter 25. And now Kapila Dev is opting to speak on the concept of Sankhya or Jnana Yoga because that was also one of the questions of Devahuti. Devahuti in total asked three questions, one on Bhakti, one on Jnana or Sankhya, and the third question was on Ashtanga Yoga, which in general in this particular section of Kapil Dev's teachings, it is mentioned as just yoga. So in Kapil Dev's teachings, if you say Sankhya, it means Jnana Yoga. If you say yoga, it means Ashtanga Yoga. And Bhakti is called just Bhakti. So the three questions were on Bhakti, Sankhya, and Yoga. So he spoke about Bhakti in the last chapter and clarified its supremost position among all the three. However, being inquisitive, Devahuti also wanted to know about Sankhya and Yoga. So, in order to answer her questions about Sankhya or Jnana Yoga, Kapil Dev is speaking this particular chapter. So, as last week, we probably saw a mention of the contents, what are in this chapter. So, this chapter begins with benefits of hearing about Sankhya Yoga, and it also deals with the interactions that happens between and the characteristics of Jiva, Prakriti, and Purusha, the three important aspects in play in the material world. The material world itself is Prakriti, and it's made for the enjoyment of the living entity. And the reason he is suffering here is because he wants to enjoy it. But the ultimate enjoyer is Purusha, is the Supreme Lord. So, a real enjoyer, a imitating enjoyer, and the enjoyed. So, in this world, it's always the enjoyer and the enjoyed. See, the real enjoyer, Purusha, the artificial or imitating enjoyer, the Jiva, and the enjoyed, Prakriti. These three concepts, interactions, and characteristics we saw in the second section from verses 3 to 8. And today we will begin with the third section where it speaks about the characteristics of the various elements of the Prakriti, the material energy. So that will be the main section. So in order to have a good idea of that section, we will also see details that we saw in the previous chapters, apart from what is mentioned just in this chapter. So I'm not sure if we will be able to complete this chapter today. Still, we will try. If anyone has any questions or something that they want to share at this point, they can. I'm sorry, I'm not able to see who's here. So whoever wants to ask a question, you always feel free to raise your hands or just unmute yourself and ask your question. So assuming that there are no questions. So we saw the benefits of hearing Sankhya because Sankhya is analytical. It frees one from the influence of the material modes, assuming that through the process of analyzing the material energy, a person gets to know how the material modes bind a person. So they gradually keep themselves, at least in the mode of goodness, and from there raise to the level of transcendence by freeing themselves from the influence of the three modes and attain perfection of self realization. That is, self realization itself a perfection. Apart from that, by achieving self realization, there is more perfections to achieve, like getting to know the Supreme Lord, cuts the knot of attachment to material world. It's a byproduct. That detachment is achieved from the material world as a byproduct. This is also one of the most important stems. This is also one of the most important differences between Bhakti Yoga and Sankhya Yoga, because in Sankhya Yoga also cutting the knot of attachment to material world is mentioned. In Bhakti also it is a part. Bhakti Yoga Bhagavati Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojitaha Janayati Ashu Vairagyam Jnanam Chayada Haitukam. So Janayati Ashu Vairagyam, that naturally there appears Vairagyam, detachment, when a person does Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojitaha, when he practices Bhakti Yoga. Here also, one of the benefits of hearing Sankhya is cuts the knot of attachment to material world. So that is detachment. The difference is here, detachment is pursued as a goal, whereas in the process of bhakti, pleasing Krishna is the goal. Achievement of detachment is a byproduct. That is the difference between the vairagya that one achieves through the process of bhakti yoga and the vairagya one achieves through the process of sankhya. Here it is a focused goal. So bhakti is used as a means to achieve detachment. But whereas in the pure bhakti yoga, it is meant to be offered for the pleasure of Krishna. In the process, a person develops detachment from the material world. So that is a subtle difference between the two. That is why this path of jnana that Kapil Dev specifically explains is called as Bhakti Mishra Jnana. That is jnana which has a little tinge of bhakti in it. So the next section we saw how Jiva, Prakriti, Purusha interactions and characteristics happens. We saw the characteristics of the Supreme Lord as someone who is beyond the three modes, who is untouched by the three modes, who is pure and transcendental, and the supplier or the maintainer of the three worlds. And we saw Purusha's interactions with Prakriti is a pastime. He chooses to. He is not forced to. However, the Jiva's interactions with the modes, excuse me, the Jiva's interactions with the modes is actually forced, or rather, it gets attached to it and gets bound by it. So that is why it gets bewildered and goes on in the cycle of birth and death. So, and then we saw how the Prakriti is the cause of the Jiva's actions. Prakriti is the material nature, provides the background for any activity that the Jiva wants to perform. It needs ingredients to perform. It has only desires. The Jiva's only possession is the desires. So, as individual living entities, what we can offer to Krishna is our desire. So, there is nothing stopping you from desiring to serve Krishna unlimitedly in your heart. And if Krishna is pleased, and if Krishna deems you qualified, he will give you actually the situations, or at least you will get the credit of having desire to serve Krishna in an unlimited way. So in your heart, there is no limits. How much you want to serve the world, how much you want to serve the association of devotees, how much you want to serve Krishna, your Guru. In your hearts, you don't have any limits. You can have unlimited desires to serve Krishna. So that is only wealth or the only freedom that we have to choose internally, at least. If Krishna sees and wants to facilitate, that's a different story. But at least in your own heart, you have unlimited opportunities to desire to serve Krishna. So that is the only property we have. However, if those desires have to manifest as a reality within this world, then you need various resources. So that is what is the material nature provides you. And in spite of doing everything, results may not manifest. And that is up to the Supreme Lord. So we may have desire and then we may have the opportunity to execute that desire, but the results of the desire may not always be guaranteed to be the same. That depends on the Supreme Lord. So this particular combination of Jiva's, the cause of the actions of the Jiva and the results of the cause of the actions of the Jiva we saw in the last discussion. So today we will begin with verse 9. So before going to the verse 9, I want to just give an introduction of this whole section. This whole section is detailed upon the process of creation. If just I will revise the process of creation, Karana Srishti, so that there will be uh, some basic idea of what we are trying to discuss later. So we all know, I have shown this multiple times. It is Karanodakashay Vishnu or Mahavishnu who lies on the causal ocean. He is a Swamshri incarnation of the Lord. He glances at the material nature, which is called Pradhan. The material nature at the beginning is inactive, is undifferentiated, is in an unmixed state because the three modes are not active. So when he impregnates the material nature called as pradhan, which is inactive, with skala, jiva, along with the jivas, the karma of the jivas and the swabhava of the jivas, when it is all impregnated, then the material nature from being in a pradhana state turns into Mahatattva because now the time energy which creates motion activates the three modes, and predominantly the sattva guna is present in this particular state when it gets first transformed, and that's called as Mahatattva. And from the in the flow of time, the sattva guna, which is mode of goodness, is overcome by passion. So when the mode of passion becomes predominant in the material nature, then that material nature is called as Sutra Tattva. And with the further flow of time, the mode of passion is overcome by the mode of ignorance, which is Ahankara or Tamas. And from that Ahankar is what is the material nature creation happens. So the current material creation that we see has been created from this stage of Ahankar. That is why it is called as we are born into ignorance. We say Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalaka. We say I am born into ignorance. It also denotes this. All the living entities are born into this world which is made of ignorance, predominantly ignorance. So in that, when I say predominantly ignorance, that means it has little goodness, it has little passion, and a lot of ignorance. So from that little goodness which is left in the material nature comes Adidaiva aspect. From the passion comes the Adi Atma aspect, and from ignorance comes the Adi Bhuta aspect. And we know what are the Adidaiva aspects, which is mind and the sense devatas. Adi Atma, the passion is prana, 10 intelligence, senses and the intelligence, and 5 tanmatras and 5 elements. So then we also see what are those 5 tanmatras and elements. Sound is a subtle tanmatra, but it manifests as ether. From ether, we get touch. Now air is produced with both the tanmatras, sound and touch. Air has both sound and touch, and from there comes form, and from form comes the subtle gross object fire, which has all the three sense objects of sound, touch and form. And from fire comes taste, which is subtle, and from that subtle sense object manifests water, which has all the four: sound, touch, form and taste. And finally from water we get smell, which is the distinguishing quality of the gross element earth, which contains all these five previous subtle sense objects. So this is Karana Srishti. All the basic ingredients are created. And then we will see Karya Srishti, which is now that all the elements are created, they have to be mixed. They are in an unmixed state. So they all will be praying to the Supreme Lord, Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. And then they all will be mixed. Once they gets mixed, then the Lord enters the cosmos. I'm sorry. So after waiting for a long time, then they get mixed by the cohesive energy of the Supreme Lord, and finally the Garbhodakshaya Vishnu enters, and then Brahma is manifested. This we saw in the previous chapters. And then he assumes the Virat Rupa. Garbhodakshaya Vishnu then expands as Virat Rupa. So now in this particular section, I just showed that as a small overview. So now we will see the section, this particular chapter, what is happening in verses 9 to 49. So here we are going to see the characteristics of each of those elements that we saw in this previous account of creation, about Pradhan, Mahatattva, and all the individual elements, the subtle sense objects like that. So let's go. I hope it's clear until now. Anyone wants to ask anything, share anything? Is it clear? Hare Krishna. Okay.
Yes, Prabhuji, your charts are all very clear. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't asking for a kind of like an acknowledgement, but I was just confused. Sorry. So in this section from verses uh, 9, we will be seeing how Devahuti first of all asks about the characteristics of Prakriti and Purusha, because she is just interested. Because here Purusha could mean the living entity or the Supreme Lord. She asks what is the characteristics of Purusha and Prakriti. So first of all, that happens in the 9th verse. Devahuti asks. Then Kapil Dev begins to explain the characteristics of Prakriti first. So what is Prakriti? Then the original Prakriti is Pradhan. From Pradhan comes all the other characters, all the other elements. So that's why he starts describing the characteristics of Pradhan, and then he will describe the characteristics of further elements. And what are the characteristics of Pradhan? He says it is unmanifested, avyakta, eternal, nityam, aggregate of the three modes, because I said it's a conglomerate of the three modes, but the three modes are inactive. The cause of Prakriti, the cause of the actual nature, like here is where the Big Bang theory comes closer to the Vedic model. It is the cause of Prakriti. From this undivided, infinite, eternal mass comes the actual manifested stage of Prakriti later, and consists of all kinds of cause and effect within that, and it is undifferentiated in that stage. It has no variety manifested because the modes are inactive. And then he also describes the products of that come from this pradhan. That is the five gross elements. We saw earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and five tanmatras, that is sound, taste, form, taste, touch, and smell, and the 10 senses, and the four antakarnas, that is manas, which is mind, buddhi, which is intelligence, false ego, ahankar, and chitta, that is consciousness. In this case, for a conditioned soul, it is contaminated. When it gets purified, then a person is liberated. So after this, he's going to go on to explain the other characteristics that we will see now. So as I said, first Devahuti asked this question about describe more about the characteristics of Prakriti and Purusha. So in response to that, Kapil Dev describes the characteristics of Prakriti, which is the material nature first. So we saw how the characteristics of Pradhana are explained in the verse 10. And then the products of the Pradhana, the 24 elements. What are the 24 elements? Five gross elements, five subtle sense objects, 10 senses, and the four antakarnas, which is mind, intelligence, false ego, and contaminated consciousness. So put together, they form 24 elements of the material nature. But there are more things which is in the Prakriti. So he explains about them. That is time, because Pradhan is there, but the time is invested into the Pradhan. So then he explains the characteristics of time, which is an energy of the Supreme Lord actually, because it is Mahavishnu who invests time into the Pradhan, which is undifferentiated. So the nature of the time which is the 25th element, of, because so far the pradhan is there and it contains 24 elements. Even though they are all undifferentiated now, it potentially contains those 24 elements. Externally, the 25th element comes, which is time. And it is the instigator of fear of death in the conditioned jivas. That is the primary characteristics of time. The instigator of fear of death and the agitator of gunas in the prakriti. The pradhan is undifferentiated, the modes are undisturbed. The time actually makes them activated. And further, because of that, the time energy can be considered as the cause of material creation, one of the causes of material creation. Lord also exists internally as Paramatma and externally as time factor. How we say in the material world, Paramatma is there in every atom and between the atoms also. The similar way, the time energy is there also everywhere. So we also always think or hear that how Guru is an external manifestation of Paramatma. Similarly, the time energy is also an external manifestation of Paramatma. That is one of the characteristics of the time factor. And then Kapila Dev explains characteristics of Mahatattva. Mahatattva is when the pradhan becomes disturbed by the time and starts changing, and the mode of goodness becomes prominent. That is when we get Mahatattva. And after the Prakriti agitates the time, the Lord impregnates it with Jivas and it gives birth to the effulgent Mahatattva. This Mahatattva is also called as sometimes Hiranmaya, and it is very glowing, it's very radiant, it's golden in hue, and it predominantly contains Sattva. So it is also sometimes called as Vasudev or Chitta manifest in the Mahatattva. It is a consciousness also manifest because the jiva is actually um, in impregnated in the material nature through the Supreme Lord. So there is consciousness now. So now the first thing that is being described after Mahat Tattva is consciousness, because that is what makes the living entity actually. Otherwise, it will be inert matter. So the consciousness is the most important aspect, but that consciousness is currently contaminated. But still, that's being discussed as the first thing by Kapil Dev. So the representation of Mahat Tattva in the body of the Jiva. What is the consciousness? That is the representation of the Mahat Tattva. The complete serenity, clarity, and freedom from distraction. This is the original nature, but when it gets contaminated, then it changes. It's restless, it's confused, and it is distracted. And then he discusses about ahankar, which is false ego, which binds the consciousness. So Mahatattva then transforms into ahankar, which is the next state. So within this also there are three modes. There is little goodness, there is little passion, and there is ignorance lot. So this goodness is called as Vaikarika, this passion is called Taijasa, and the ignorance is called Tamasa. And the presiding deity of this Ahankar, this is not necessarily the individual living entity's Ahankar. Here we are discussing about the material elements, the collective uh, nature, material nature in the stage when there it is predominantly in the mode of ignorance. So the material nature is being discussed here. The presiding deity is Sankarshan. That is why Lord Shiva is considered to be meditating on Sankarshan, and also to respect, he also has the snakes around his neck, around his hands, like that, because they are all actually objects which induce his meditation. Because Sankarshan is is like is also the Sankarshan manifests as Ananta or Sesha later. So he is in a snake form. So Anantadev, on whom the Lord rests, is an expansion of Sankarshan. So characteristics of this particular ahankar is it acts as the doer consciousness. It's the consciousness which makes us feel I am the doer, and it becomes an instrument also, and it becomes the effect also. So also acts as the influence of the modes, the false ego, and then comes mind. The mind comes from the false ego in the mode of goodness that we saw. I showed you in the chart. There was ahankar. If I want, I can show it again. Oh, Krishna. Yeah. If you see this particular chart, from goodness comes, from goodness comes mind, and this mind is what we are discussing. This is not the individual living entity's mind, but a collective mind as the form of the material nature.
Hi, Krishna Prabhuji. Can I ask a few questions?
Yes.
So, I have three currently.
Is this,
When
should I just leave it in this slide, or you want to go back into some other slide?
No, this slide is fine. So it's actually so can you, and I apologize if I missed it earlier in past lectures as well, but so specifically the Mahatattva, from my understanding, is the medium in which basically the soul experiences the material world. But my question is, in one sense, if I think about these elements, they, I don't say they're steady, but in essence, how a human perceives the world is different from how a horse perceives the world, how a ladybug perceives the world. So, does this mean then that the Mahatattva, I guess, mutates, or it's not a fixed element in one sense, based on the form in one sense, because again, the way that Jiva perceives or experiences the material world is going to be different depending on, I guess, what body uh, it takes. Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit more about just the Mahatattva then and the characteristics?
Okay. When you say the perception of a human being, animals, different various species, their experience of the material nature is different. However, the material nature in itself has a certain characteristics. We, based on our body and its ability, we can only experience certain aspects, and we can only see certain manifestations, and to a certain degree. But in reality, what is Mahatattva is what we are discussing. How it's being perceived by different entity could be different, could be varying depending on the karma that they have and the instruments of interaction, the instruments of perception that they have received from the material nature based on their karma. That could differ, but the reality in itself does not change. Say for example, you go to a pyramid, you go to the Giza pyramid of in Egypt, and then you are walking up. There is an ant there which also crawls. You may see the pyramid differently, the ant may see the pyramid differently, but the pyramid in itself is the same true one entity. Does that answer your question?
Not really. I apologize. Maybe I just need to sit with it a little longer. Because in that example, the pyramid, yes, is prakriti. It's just, it's matter. It's material. So that doesn't change. But I guess it's for even the jiva to experience the material world, it must perceive through the mahatattva, and so that means the mahatattva, I guess, changes or is different per entity depending on the form it has is taken. Is that correct, or is not? Maybe my understanding of Mahatattva is just not deep enough for me to fully grasp.
Say for these things also, what we are seeing currently is all manifestations of the Mahatattva. So I'm really not able to get your question then, because I'm thinking in that example, the pyramid is material nature. Like that, the manifestation, there's so many manifestations of the material nature. Our body is also a manifestation of the material nature. How we see, perceive, and experience could change based on the limitations that we have. But what we are trying to discuss here as Mahatattva is the sum total of all material elements, which is in the mode of goodness, which has not even manifested anything yet. The Mahatattva here in this particular slide is referring to the material nature, which is predominantly in the mode of goodness, from which nothing has come. That will transform into Ahankar. From that Ahankar, we will be manifesting things like false ego, mind, intelligence, senses. These are all actually conglomerate. These are all congregate. These are all not individual living entities. These are all universal conceptual things. From then, Brahmaji is going to come. From Brahmaji will come. From Brahmaji later, we will be given the individual material bodies. So this particular Mahatattva that we are discussing is very different from the material nature that you and me interact here today.
Thank you. That's much more helpful. And I think this leads to my next question. It's very interesting how you say it's not the individual's mind or false ego, it's just the kind of entirety of it. But in one sense, how do we wrap our heads around that? Is it just the, I guess it's the element that's created and then later on it's manifest or kind of, I guess, applied to individual entities? Um, I guess a better example is when I think the mind, it's very hard for me to think that it's in the mode of goodness, because it's we read in the Gita, can be one's worst enemy and one must conquer the mind. And I would think that intelligence would be under the mode of goodness and maybe mind would be under the mode of passion. But it sounds like as an element itself, removing itself from the living entities, it falls into these categories, I guess, mind and goodness and intelligence and passion. But what does that actually mean when you say the mind in its entirety? Or how do we even fully understand that?
So your question is, when you say these are all actually not individual living entities, but like the collective aggregate element itself, how do we understand that? How do I see an universal mind and universal intelligence? And that also seems to be mind is coming from mode of goodness, which seems to be our personal experience of the mind seems to be the other way, like that. Is that the question?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The first thing to understand about the aggregate, it will be somewhat our intelligence cannot grasp beyond certain things, because it's beyond our actual experience, our perceptional experience. To some extent we have to take it from the scriptures, that the scripture says, okay, this is how the creation happens, because there is no individual way of verifying it to some extent apart from the authorities that we trust in. Still, just for the sake of trying to better understand what is being presented in the scriptures, we can use our intelligence, God-given intelligence, to whatever extent is possible to understand how this works. So if you read the second canto, this particular topic is for the first time introduced in Bhagavatam, and then in canto 3 chapter 5 also, where the creation is discussed. So these are represented as elements, and these elements will have their respective demigods, but they are all like being created as placeholders or profiles, like that. Plus they also have what you call, it's the collective in mind. When you say it's the attributes which are being refer to certain aspect of the material nature. And then when they all like are individually there but they cannot create anything, then when they are put together, they don't become active until the Supreme Lord enters the material nature. Then he enters their Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. Still, your question remains how to understand them. To some extent, Mahatattva is also inconceivable. That is one of the characteristics of Pradhana and Mahatattva that we saw. Even if you see the scientists, they will speak about Big Bang, and then you ask them the what was existing before Big Bang. So numerically, it is infinite. By their equations, when they try to explain the state before the Big Bang happened, the state of universal uh, existence as a primordial soup, they call it. You ask them what is that primordial soup, how can you explain? In scientific terms, they will say the same things that we say for Pradhan, that it is indescribable, it is inconceivable, it is eternal, it is infinite. The same characteristics they will explain in mathematical equations, because that is the very nature of the material nature itself, what to speak of the spiritual nature. Does did I kind of, I may not have answered you, at least did I address the first aspect of your question, first part of your question?
Yes, you did. I have to sit with it a bit more because it's an inconceivable of just what does it mean to be a collective mind. But your explanation did make sense. I just, if I kind of nitpick it a little bit more, that's where I just have more questions. But can I also ask quickly then, could you describe what is the main difference between, say, chitta and mind and the manas? Because essentially the chitta is the mind. So is manas just the kind of like yes, no, or like, dislike? Um, I just have always thought chitta meant mind as well. So what's the main difference between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. So now we have two questions, the second part of your previous question and this one. So let me take the second part of the let me take this first and then I can go there also. So it's a very valid question. What is chitta? What is mind? What is even intelligence? And what is ahankar? Kapil Dev in the further sections also will explain how our chitta itself has these four aspects. They are functionally different. They are not like physically different living entities. This is one unit which is called chitta, but when in overall it's just consciousness, but when that consciousness behaves in a certain way, it is called, can be called as ahankar, it can be called as manas, a mind, which can be called as intelligence. So functionally they are differentiated, but in terms of their existence they are one unit. That is why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says cheto darpana marjanam. So we very simply translate in English that chitta as mind, but that is not that simple. The chitta there he is referring is the overall collective consciousness of the living entity, cleaning the consciousness of the living entity, which involves subduing the ego, subduing the intelligence, subduing the mind, everything involved. So even in our the subtle body, that's why it is subtle body, it's very difficult to perceive, and it is one unit. Based on its interactions, based on its behavior, you can only find, oh, now my mind is active, my intelligence is active, my ego is being active, like that. But collectively they are one unit called as chitta, which is primarily consciousness, but in the conditioned state that consciousness is contaminated, so it is called as separate chitta, which is contaminated consciousness. And then because we also manifest the functionalities of ahankar, manas, and buddhi in the conditioned state. In the pure state also, we will purify this, and based on the activities, the functionality, the chitta will either manifest as pure ego or pure intelligence or pure mind. This is what I've heard from my teachers. So I hope this kind of answers that part.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And the second part of your previous question is, oh, we see that the mind is coming from mode of goodness, but the nature is chanchalam hi mana Krishna pramati balavadridam. Krishna, Arjuna says to Krishna that chanchalam, it's continuously shifting, changing, and flickering. And the intelligence is supposed to be the higher thing. What we are seeing again is not the individual, our mind's nature, or our intelligence nature. Where we are coming from does not limit what we can be. The mind is manifested from mode of goodness, because in its original state, only if it is in the mode of goodness, it can actually assist in its in when I'm saying about the individual's mind. But it has not so much of a correlation here. Here mind comes from mode of goodness. What is the reason? One way to answer is like, that's how it is happening, so I don't know. If I have to add a little bit of a speculation, then the senses, devatas, they are all coming from the mind also, the mode of goodness also. And the one of the sense is the moon, which is also a sense devata, which represents, no, this logic cannot fly, because all the sense devatas are all anyway in the mode of goodness. I don't know the answer. This is how it is explained in the Bhagavatam, that the mind comes from mode of goodness. I don't see, just because it comes from mode of goodness, that its nature should be mode of goodness. There is no correlation there. And the same way we see intelligence, Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, intelligence in the mode of goodness, intelligence in the mode of passion, intelligence in the mode of ignorance. So even though it is produced from the passion within the material nature, which is predominantly in ignorance, still it does not limit the individual's intelligence to be in a certain mode. They are very different things. That's why I was saying this is the aggregate intelligence, this is our individual intelligence. Where they are coming from does not limit our ability to be present in a certain mode.
Thank you so much, Krishna.
I hope that was okay. So yeah, just to conclude that, so our individual mind intelligence can be brought into any modes that we desire, or even transcend the modes that we want. They are not limited by from this account of, oh, the aggregate buddhi or manas is coming from a particular. But why they are coming from that particular mode, that I have not generally seen, because the Vedic scriptures sometimes don't go into these kind of details. They just give, because they are fine. So much of more details are not given. So, but to one thing we can understand is all these things are created from ahankar, which is material nature in the mode of ignorance. So predominantly the material nature is itself is coming from ignorance only. Mother Gail, are you trying to ask a question?
Hi, Krishna Prabhu. Yes, thank you. I don't know, did Athena finish, or I don't know.
I think yes, finished. I hope so.
Yes, please go ahead, Mother Gail.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not clear about this concept of contaminated consciousness. I think you seem to have been speaking about it as almost like a material element or something. And so can you distinguish it from the consciousness that emanates from the soul, which I think always remains pure, and is never touched by material nature. So because of that, I'm unclear about the concept of contaminated consciousness. It seems like a contradiction to the philosophy in some way.
Okay. It's an amazing question. So you're basically asking, how is this consciousness, which is supposed to be pure, because the soul is pure, its consciousness is originally pure, why are we discussing it as contaminated?
Correct.
And I'll add to your question, because it's my question also. As you are asking and I'm reflecting, I'm also asking, I'm getting another question. I'll add that at the end. So the first of all, we are describing here in this section the elements that come from material nature, right? And
Yes.
how is then even consciousness coming? Because The material nature does not have consciousness. That is the difference between living entity and consciousness on material nature. First of all,
Yes.
speaking consciousness should not be part of this discussion,
Yes.
because it's not the its consciousness is one, not the characteristics of the material elements. So, however, when we are discussing here, we are not discussing the consciousness as a aspect of material nature. In the original sense, when the soul's consciousness is pure, that is the sign of the soul. However, when it interacts with the material nature, because of the its intelligence, mind, and senses and false ego, it gets covered due to its identification with matter or the body. Then that is when the consciousness is considered contaminated. The identification is the problem.
Hmm. So, although I'm just trying to figure this out. So, although our consciousness, I don't know, the pure, I mean, the soul never changes. That's chapter 2 of the Gita.
It's covered. Consciousness is pretty much, if you see Bhagavad Gita in the third chapter, Krishna says, "Tu me na vriyate vahnir," means yatol bena. So it's like either the consciousness is always pure. It's either like a smoke is being covered by the fire is being covered by the smoke, or the child is being covered in a womb. In this,
Yeah.
so that like that, the consciousness is covered by these contaminations, but they are not changing the nature of the consciousness. Like the fire remains fire. The smoke cannot go change the quality of the fire itself.
Okay, so then therefore, I guess what my question now is what it really means for the consciousness to be covered if it doesn't actually change, you know? If the consciousness identifies this material nature, that sounds, I don't know how that is different from saying the consciousness changes.
Srila Prabhupada in one place explains how, say, for example, there is sun which evaporates the water of the ocean and creates the clouds. But the cloud
Yes.
itself covers the sun from the eyes of the living entities. Even though the cloud is the source of, the sun is the source of the clouds, and it is much more powerful, still it can be covered by the cloud. Similarly, the living entity, when it creates some kind of attachment, even though it's much more powerful, the pure consciousness, but when it thinks it is dealing with the material world, and it belongs to the material world, it creates a cloud around its consciousness, but the cloud is not mixing with its consciousness. It creates the inability for the living entity to experience its full potential. It is the source. Its own bewilderment is the source of that cloud. Still, that cloud has the potential to limit its ability to see.
Okay. I just feel that if consciousness is always pure,
Mhm.
when it focuses on material nature and identifies with it, at that moment of identification, that sounds like the consciousness changes from being pure.
Yeah,
At that very moment.
our own understanding of purity, impurity is one thing, but in essence, that's what, like, when it ultimately the consciousness is pure, nothing can actually contaminate it. It can only be covered temporarily. That's what we are being. told, and that is the experience also. The
Yeah,
moment
I think,
you understand
you know,
something, all the past misconceptions just disappear. Like, say for example, somebody is doing certain things, like somebody was gambling earlier and now they don't gamble. The moment you realize this is not something, it's just the past is almost like an illusion. Even though it was all reality, it's almost like an illusion once you wake up to the reality.
yeah, anyway, I don't want to take up more class time, but I know that the problem lies in this word covering, you
Covering.
know? Yeah, that's where the problem lies.
Covering
So,
is our inability to experience the actual benefits of the pure consciousness. Like, as soul, I don't need to fear. As soul, I don't need to lament. I don't need to hanker. But because my attachment is there, I will fear. I'll lament. I'll hanker, even though I don't need to.
yes, but you see, attachment is there, I feel, because some because the consciousness was changed somehow. You know, a pure consciousness, they're not going to identify this, they're
The
not going to come under, you know, just the fact that we become under ignorance. It sounds to me like a change in the consciousness. Some change was there. You know, otherwise, a pure consciousness cannot be in ignorance.
that concept also we saw in the previous chapters once. The material energy has two types of bewildering potency. One is the covering and one is the throwing. So if you see, Brahmaji creates, first of all, in his creation he creates five types of illusion. So the
Yeah.
concept need not be changed. It only has to be covered with those identifications. That's what first he created, because the living entity cannot exist in this material world and identify with this body if those extra like coverings were not there of the illusion. So that illusory covering is what is making us forcefully identify ourselves with the body.
Yes, you see, and I keep coming back to the same point, Prabhu, you know, that
To you when
this
you're
this
born into
this
this world,
this
because without
covering sounds like change to me. You know, covering,
change,
I
say
don't see the difference between covering and change really.
for
That's
example,
my thought.
when you go into a jail, they don't want you to see certain things. They'll forcefully like put a mirror, put a glass on your eyes, fix it permanently.
Yes.
So the eyes, the original eyes have not changed, but now all you
Yeah.
can see only through the glasses. Because when
Hmm.
you came in as a punishment, they already put it. It's you don't have a choice. So similarly, when we came to this material world, by default we were bewildered by those five types of illusion. Removing it,
Hmm.
what is the process we are seeing? How do you remove it?
Hmm.
That is what Devahuti is asking Kapil Dev. How do I remove this, break this connection between the living entity and the material nature? Because material
You know.
nature is a fixed thing. So that is why I'm saying covering, because the eye still retains its ability to see, but because it through the mirror or the glass, so it can only perceive that everything is like pale, or everything is dark, or whatever is the nature of the
Hmm.
particular glass it's wearing. But the moment you actually take the glass out, your eyes are still has the original ability that has not changed.
Hmm.
Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is helpful.
When we come
You
into the
know.
world as punishment, we are given these glasses,
Hmm. Hmm.
because without identification with the body, you cannot take birth in a body.
So it, you know, it seems like the purity of our consciousness that never changes is really only our ability to have awareness of, you know, our environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that never changes. But what we become aware of, that depends on, you know, whether we're wearing the glasses or not, or whether we are in, whether we have been presented with illusion or not. Like if our if Lord Brahma puts a particular picture in front of us, then we will see that. If we are presented with a different picture, then we will see that. So the consistency is that our ability to perceive, let's say, that doesn't change. But what may change is what it is that we are perceiving.
How we are perceiving also. Yeah, there are various perspectives to this whole thing. It's not one simple one perspective thing. There are various aspects to how, because it's even like it is inconceivable to us how we even became conditioned, because that's a secret. Like you're put in a jail, all the procedures are not told to the prisoners. So similarly, this body is actually a jail, is a prison. How we are put into it is Brahmaji knows the manual, and that's what is trying to be opened up like the scriptures are opening up for us to some extent to understand principally that this is a prison and we have been imprisoned and we have to break out of it. In principle, the scriptures are trying to explain that to us. It's very detailed, it's very difficult to understand every aspect of it, because it is said even for Brahmaji it's quite inconceivable to see how the material nature functions.
Okay, Prabhu. Well, certainly food for thought.
Okay.
Thank you so much for trying with me. I mean, your analogy, was helpful, to at least make some headway into what I'm confused about. Yes, I mean, the cloud analogy, the jail analogy, those were helpful. So thank you very much.
I mean, both of these analogies I think I've heard from Prabhupada in different places, but maybe sometimes the same analogy is used for different aspects. But surely I have seen these in Prabhupada's purpose.
And I've also come to understand that it's not actually a resolved issue, that the fact that the consciousness never changes yet.
Kind of leads to the discussion of the jiva fall a little bit. The deeper you go, that's where it kind of like little bit it will go there also. If you pursue it, it can go there. There are different angles to all these issues also. I try to answer two ways, to be very honest. One is to share what I know. Plus, also I try to limit it from going to a very crazy area where
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We don't want to open that Pandora's box, I know.
which is like which just can any discussion can go to all these kind of stumbling blocks. But in essence, what the chapter comes to say does not change actually. Devhuti's question of, okay, I'm in prison now, how do I break out of this? That aspect always remains true for us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
depending on our intellectual ability and depending on our ability to contemplate and ask questions, we can try to understand more details, but still we can never lose track of the central issue of, okay, however or whatever way I'm imprisoned, but how do I break out of this? That can never change. So to some extent, we can try to work on those things, which in understanding how I came to this bondage. But still, I'm in bondage is a true thing, and I have to break bondage is still more true. So
Yes, that's the priority.
yeah, it's a kind of balance sometimes. But there is nothing like, oh, you should not ask those questions. At the same time, oh, if I don't understand, still I can see this side. Okay, that's why Prabhupada in the Bhagavad Gita also in one place he says, "Oh, the house is in fire, get out." But that is not the only way we can always see. Prabhupada also sometimes try to answer why the house is fire. But he said, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
it's not very conceivable for us, so don't worry about it much."
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I kind of try to touch and come. I don't try to stay long. Of course, it's my individual flavor also. I try to keep away from the topics because to some extent I also don't understand, to be extremely honest, because Bhaktivinoda Thakur also says it's quite difficult for conditioned souls to actually figure to understand, even if it is explained by a liberated soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yes.
But thank you so much for delving into this forest for me with me.
So it's very little section. We can complete the 49th verse. Very bad for dragging this chapter for a long time. So let's see if it can be complete quickly. So we saw, I pasted this section earlier also in the slides, how all these elements come from the previous elements. And then Kapil Dev explains the characteristics of each of those elements, that how ether provides the space, and touch provides softness or hardness, or cold or heat is distinguished through touch, how air gives the ability to move, vata, movement, and form allows dimension, and the quality of the form or the individuality is achieved through form, and fire illuminates ability to cook, digest, destroy, cold, to evaporate, and taste, although one, taste becomes manifold. Like it's a very complicated subject, it's almost inconceivable. Taste is one, like the ability to taste is one, but the same particular object, the sense organ, can actually taste different uh, things, like astringent or sweet or bitter or pungent or sour or salty. So it's quite an inconceivable thing how this small piece of flesh can actually very clearly manifest or experience different kinds of taste. It's quite a wonder. And just imagine having a tongue which does not taste anything. It just tastes everything as one. How boring life would be. And water, because it moistens, it actually causes it gives satisfaction. Water also, and gives life, relieves thirst. It softens things, extinguishes heat, and also increases, being plentiful, it increases quantity. And smell, which yeah, the same way, smell also can be foul or fragrant or mild or strong or acidic. And the earth, which is the one of the smell, is the one of the distinguishing quality of the element earth, is actually the place of sustenance for all beings. And it's a steadiness comes from earth element. So in this way, he explains all the various elements, and we know how all the cause effects in the effect exist in the cause exist in the effect. Like sound is leads to ether, so ether has both space and sound, and that leads to touch, and then that leads to air. In this way, all the other things proceed, and in each of the created element, the qualities of the cause also is included. And then we saw this slides of Karya Srishti earlier. So then from this particular Karya Srishti, where everything is brought together by Garbhodakshay Vishnu, after entering Garbhodakshay Vishnu manifest Virat Rupa, which is the universal form. There is a whole description of how from the Lord's gross sense organ comes the subtle sense organ of the Virat Rupa, and the sense Devatas are manifested. And from there, the living entity actually develops its desire from the Virat Rupa. And the whole discussion of Virat Rupa we had in the Canto 2 as well as Canto 3, some sections. So then the Devatas actually wanted, now the Devatas are all created. So Devatas wanted to wake up the Virat Purusha. So we will see what is the meaning of that. And then the Virat Rupa does not arise just by the Devatas calling them. Only when Lord Vasudeva enters the heart of the Virat Rupa, then the Virat Rupa actually arises. It is to indicate how the prana, mind, intelligence, they all can be there. But without the soul or the intervention of the super soul, then the living and the body cannot be active. And that's the example given. And then the goal of explaining the analysis of all these elements. The whole purpose of this particular chapter is to contemplate on the super soul through devotion, detachment, and spiritual knowledge. That is the whole purpose. So we saw the 24 material elements. The 25th element is the time. The 26th element is the individual soul, jiva, we saw. And then the 27th, the ultimate element, it does not belong to the material nature. The Supreme Lord does not belong to the material nature, but the one who's actually responsible for everything acting here is the super soul. That's why here the Virat Rupa is being explained. That the Virat Rupa is created, the demigods are all created, but the Virat Rupa does not become activated unless Lord Vasudeva enters the heart of the Virat Rupa, indicating how just by having prana, just by having mind, just by having intelligence, the soul cannot be activated. The super soul also has to come into the body. So that is why the whole purpose of explaining this chapter is to understand that beyond the material nature there is soul and there is super soul. And this has a very deep implication philosophically, because there is a atheistic Sankhya philosophy also which stops at the 24 elements of the material nature, maximum the time element, nothing beyond. They don't agree with the soul's existence. So some philosophers agree with the soul's existence, but they will not go until the super soul. But Kapila Sankhya is the complete Sankhya, which includes not just the 24 elements, not just the time element, 25th element, not just the jiva, which is the 26th, but also the ultimate object of all these analysis, which is the super soul. So that is also included. That is the purpose of explaining this whole chapter, to understand that there is material nature, there is jiva, but above both of them there is also super soul. To contemplate on here that super soul through devotion and through detachment and through spiritual knowledge is the process of jnana yoga. So that will be explained in the next chapter. Now we just analyze the material nature. In the next chapter we will understand the material nature and also the process of execution of this process of Bhakti Mishra Gyan that we will be seeing in the next chapter. So thank you very much for your patient listening, and in the next week we will discuss the method of Bhakti Mishra Gyan and the method for which is the method for attaining liberation. So we will see the 27th chapter next week. So thank you very much for joining and your attentive presence. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava ki jai. Anchakalpataru Vaishya Kripa Sindhubhyo Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Hare Krishna, everyone, for joining. Since it's late, let's end the session here. Thank you very much, Hare Krishna.